Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Really, really happy to welcome you here today on this webinar. We have a real treat with Caroline Keeley at the helm of this presentation. Bonjour tout le monde, très heureux de vous accueillir où que vous soyez au pays. This is an especially important topic today. In fact, two super important topics that tend to intersect communication and change. And as communication experts, most of you, you understand how communication is at the core of a successful transformative journey. And when I say journey, I think that's precisely what most of our organizations are going through these days. It's not as if change is one thing that you do one week and then it's done. It's an ongoing process, and we have learned to live with it, but we have to give ourselves the right tools to make it successful. So we're looking at creating success for you as individuals, as professionals, but also increase efficiency for your own organizations. Many of you will know Caroline Keeley. Many of you are here probably because of Caroline Keeley. You've seen her resume, internationally recognized and award-winning expert in specifically this field. And over the past few years, we've been working very, very closely with Caroline. And what she has been hearing in both private and public sector organizations and leaders is that we need to professionalize this world of communication and change. And this is where we created our leadership development program for communicators. You will have seen a link to that, I guess, in the invitation. We'll probably say a word about that at the end for those of you who might be interested. But I'm mindful that this is only a 1-hour session, so I'll shut up right now, turn it over to Caroline, who will dazzle you, of course, as she always does with this content. Merci, Caroline. And have a nice
Merci,
session.
Serge. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you. I hope that you've not had too much technical difficulty. We had a bit of a password issue at the beginning of our session. And Sonia and Jordana, I see there are folks in the waiting room, so I'll let you admit people so that I can get cracking with our content. So I am thrilled to be here today to talk about one of the most important topics and one that is near and dear to my heart, which is how communicators can be effective change makers. Certainly what I have observed, as Serge indicates, in my practice doing executive training and workshops with communication teams now around the world is quite a common constellation of patterns. And it's sort of one in which communicators are so often finding themselves to be underwhelmed, but also overwhelmed. And so some of the fun and sparkle of our job seems to have evaporated. And on the other hand, we're kind of drowning in data and in mixed signals and situations that often can be quite frustrated. So that's what we hope to bust through today with this little nugget on communicators as change makers. So to get us started, I thought I would invite you to pop in the chat where you're joining us from. So if you can pop in the city and organization perhaps that you're representing in the chat so we can get a sense of who's in the room. I've got 59 people so far, which is great. We've got some folks from Ottawa, of course, and also Canada's Drug Agency, Toronto Public Health, Agriculture, Winnipeg, La Cité Collégiale, bienvenue, and some folks from Winnipeg. We actually have a huge registration list for today's session, obviously a very popular topic, and one that is designed as a bit of a appetizer, if you will, for the Leadership Development Program for Communicators, which Serge mentioned. This is a really in-depth cohort-based program that I lead at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute, and it's all about elevating the communications professional and trying to draw a bigger box for the function. So you've probably seen information about that, and today is a bit of a small taster of that context. We've got folks from Western, hi Mark, and some co-working sites as well. So lovely to see everyone here today. So what I'm going to do is just quickly share my chat, share my desktop rather, so that we can pop into our presentation. Just one moment, please. There we go. And then see what we can cover in our brief period of time. Jordan, is the screen working okay?
I'm seeing the whole layout. I don't know if you can change the
Okay.
presentation
Yeah.
mode.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, this was a problem I was having earlier. There we go. Okay, hopefully this should be
Looks
better.
good.
Okay, excellent. So as Serge mentions, our topic today is really communicators as change makers. And the backdrop for our conversation is that whatever your job title is, your real job is actually change. And so as we're going to discover together, this is bad news and also some pretty great news. Okay, so the bad news is that what we find is in participants who are joining today who have titles like communication officer, communication manager, outreach manager, we have some communication VPs, communication director, that title is often kind of confusing these days because the order of business and what we're asked to do, what our organizations need from us, is quite ill-defined. And so that becomes a problem because it can lead to disconnects, misfires, a lot of frustration, a lot of churn. On the other hand, the great news is that whatever your title is kind of not the point, because in essence, your real job is change. What organizations are needing, what they're craving, is precisely the energy and the sense making and the capabilities of communication professionals, irrespective of your title, and also, importantly, irrespective of your level. And so this is an interesting paradox that I'm seeing among many of my clients, that communication professionals want to make an impact, they want to make a difference, and often feel frustrated that they're held back by bureaucracy or rules. And at the same time, these very communication professionals, their bosses tell me that they're frustrated because they wish their communications talent would just step up, quit asking for permission, and just dive in and add value. And so that's in essence what we're trying to unlock, is basically treat the bad news of the disorientation that's caused by the fact that we no longer really know what our job is, and our job descriptions are almost certainly outdated. But how do we harness the possibility and the opportunity that that represents? Because we really have an unprecedented opportunity to draw a bigger box and redefine the rules of the game. And so that is the invitation for today's session. Someone's asking Sabrina here on the chat as to whether we're sharing the presentation, and absolutely, we will be sharing a video of the presentation at the end by email, along with an evaluation form. So you will certainly get that. So another interesting backdrop to our conversation is this idea from Terence Mowry, who's written a brilliant book called The Upside of Disruption. And he reminds us that really we're at a point where we're amid two super cycles, technological and geopolitical. And this is the slowest they will ever be in our lifetimes. And that kind of got me into a cold sweat. When you think about, if this is the slowest our lifetimes are going to be, it's hard to imagine where we're going. But again, that is also very much the environment in which we can sort of elevate ourselves and move out of traditional confines, because the rules of the game are changing. We know, for example, with AI is a huge transformation. We don't want to be commoditized in work that could be replicated and probably done better and faster by AI, but rather we want to use those kinds of technologies to prop us up so that we are liberated to focus our talent on higher order activities. Another part of why this period is so challenging and that people are feeling unmoored is that change itself has changed. And so let's pop again into the chat and see if you can contribute some ideas here to give us a sense of what kind of changes are you working on in your organization. If you can just brainstorm, do a kind of a quick brain dump in terms of listing the kinds of changes that you are being asked to work on. And we'll use that to sort of fuel our conversation around the nature of change having changed. I'll kick us off and indicate that when I began doing work in change communication, which was probably about 10 or 12 years ago, the kinds of changes that we were working on tended to be technological. And so a big challenge would be, okay, my organization is implementing a new system like an online procurement system or SAP, and this is super stressful, everybody's freaking out. And so we need our communications team to come and help navigate this change. And of course, now with the benefit of the rear view mirror, we can see that that was probably a sort of a cakewalk combined when we compare it to the kinds of changes and compound change on change that we're dealing with now. So for example, we're seeing in the chat, there are lots of different changes, a buffet of options that you folks are dealing with. Could be things around focus of your work, ERP implementation, process changes, return to office, amalgamating two separate office groups into one, change projects that are going on, increase multimedia production. So that kind of gives you a flavor for the complexity and the nuanced approach to the kinds of changes we're dealing with at the moment. And to be candid, one of the biggest things that I find among my client organizations that we work with is that the thing that's changing is itself not really clear. And so again, these are the kinds of conditions that are very fatiguing. People feel unmoored, they feel disconnected, and that is an environment ripe for anxiety, conflict, and disengagement. So that's the problem that we aim to fix. So I just want to address this question of how is it that change has changed from traditional models of change management, for example, that you may have been exposed to. And I think it comes down to three main traits. The first, as I mentioned already, is that the nature of change that we tend to be working on is emergent. And so what I mean by that is that it's not too clear what the destination is. We sort of feel that we're building the airplane while we're flying it. And I see here we've got a good technology meme there to give us a sense of what that feels like. So that's the first thing, is that we're dealing with emergent change, where it tends to be that we're more clear on what we're no longer going to be, we're less clear as to where we're going. The next one is the compounding nature of change. So it's not just that we're restructuring, it's that we're also dealing with culture change or org change or strategic change or operational change, or it could be socio-political changes. So the compounding effect of the change on change environment in which we're operating tends to be particularly and uniquely challenging and disorienting. And then the third thing is that we're dealing with transformational change instead of incremental change. And so when you think about it, what's the difference between change and transformation? When we use the expression transformation, we're talking about something that has permanently changed into a new state. So for example, a good analogy that I like is if you're making a cake, you had sugar, flour, eggs, and milk, and now this has turned into a cake, and you cannot go back to the former state of eggs and milk, right? So that's kind of the degree of change that we're dealing with, is that we're not going back. So against this backdrop, I'd love to get a sense from the group in terms of more color around your experience in the trenches in working in these kinds of changes, particularly around your role and what you need to feel set up for success. So I'm going to have my colleague Jordana share screen, please. And we're going to jump into a quick Mentimeter exercise. And the code is going to appear at the top of your screen in a moment. So you'll be needing, you can do this on your phone or on your computer screen, and you'll be going to menti.com. And in a moment, I'm hoping Jordana will be able to share the screen and we can see our questions for today. I will say this topic of being set up to succeed in your role is absolutely fundamental. And that's kind of the golden rule, is do not accept the conditions that have you set up for to fail. So we want to make sure that at all times you are set up with the right conditions to succeed. Great. So here we are at the Menti poll. And so again, I'm going to ask you to go to menti.com, and the code is at the top of the page here. 84219987. So you should be seeing the code at the very top of the room, and this will allow you to do the Mentimeter survey. So the first question, how would you rate the level of disruption in your organization? So if you think about things like pandemic, hybrid, new processes, priorities, maybe new leaders coming in, what is the level of disruption that this is creating? So far, we've got most of you, we got 12 people at 4 out of 5, and 8 are at a very high level. So that doesn't surprise me much. I'll just give another few moments for answers to come in. Okay, so what's interesting here is that nobody is at very low. We got one person at the lowish level and then 3 at the medium. So generally, and not surprisingly, perhaps by virtue of you signing up to this webinar, you're at the higher end of the scale. And so that's significant because it's tiring working in a high level of disruption. It's high risk, and it's often quite frustrating because we're trying to do our best, but our best keeps changing, and the rules of the game are often not very clear. So let's move on to the next question, please. So how would you describe your organization's change landscape? So change leadership literature usually is in 2 buckets. You can have an environment where you're doing mostly behavioral change. You may be focusing on mindset change, or it may be that you're working on both behavior and mindset changes. And so far, the vast majority of you signing in so far are at the both behavior and mindset change. And that, again, is such an important insight, because the reality is people will sometimes say, well, why do we have to worry about this change management and change leadership business anyway, since if the boss tells you to do things, use this new computer system or follow this new process, aren't you just going to do that because of the gravitational pull of your organization's hierarchy? And what we find is that most often what appears on the surface to be a behavior change, like, for example, use a new CRM system, a customer relationship management system, underneath that is really a mindset change. For example, we worked with a not-for-profit organization that was implementing a new customer relationship management system where people had to put in their stakeholders that they were dealing with and get a sense for tracking their conversations and their activity. So the problem was not the technology. That's complex, but could be managed. The problem is not getting people to know how to use the system, because again, that was relatively straightforward. But the real problem is that that technology change was supposed to bring about a mindset shift. In this case, that everybody is responsible for stakeholder engagement and not one employee owns, if you will, a stakeholder relationship. So that is a great example of where it can be disconcerting and disorienting when it's unclear whether we're dealing just with behavior change or mindset change. And increasingly what we're observing is that it's both. And if there's one thing that we know for sure, is that we cannot change a person's mind. We can just create the conditions for them to change their own mind. And that is a beautiful opportunity and exactly squarely where communicators come in. So let's go to the next question, please. Okay, this is a toughie. So if you were asked to explain your organization's change agenda or its priority in 1 sentence, could you do it? Sure thing. This is kind of hard, or no way. Okay. So, yeah, most of you are coming in on, this is pretty hard. This is absolutely my consistent experience working with client organizations, is that it is surprisingly difficult to try to make the complex simple. And in an environment of the attention economy, where really the attention and the energy and focus of our employees is the arena of performance, this is a huge deal. Again, a massive opportunity for communication professionals, first of all, who are in the business of trying to make the complex clear, also in the business of managing the signal to noise ratio to make sure that we're being attentive to the attention, energy, and focus of our employees, and that we're also providing enough context. And I would say uniformly, when I work with senior executives and you ask them exactly this question, you find that they struggle. And so if things are a little bit unclear at the top, you can see how it gets increasingly unclear as you move down across the organization, and why communicators as change makers play a huge, huge role. Now, I should say, and we'll get into this a little bit later, not to say that the communicator should be responsible for the full change. So that's a problem also, that sometimes in an environment of unclear roles, that sometimes we tend to punt the ball of communication to a comms officer instead of it being squarely a leadership capability. So in many ways, in that kind of context, you could think of it that the communicator is like the roadie to the rock star who is the change sponsor. So we'll come back to this, but suffice it to say, this is not straightforward. And only 9 of you could easily explain your organization's change agenda in a sentence. So next question, please. Okay, so this is the last one. If you had a magic wand and could change just one thing to make the change landscape in your organization easier to navigate, what would it be? This one is a word cloud, so it may be longer. Remove approvals. Okay, I totally love this. So this is such a typical thing that I see, and I really appreciate your having the guts to raise that, because I see consistently communication teams that are under the gun. Bosses are saying they want the teams to be more agile, more responsive, quicker to turn things around. And yet they are working under crushing and broken approval systems. And so that's a really great point, that we need to have enabling conditions in order to perform. And one of those is the air cover to be able to go. So, racehorses need to be able to race, and it is not cool if organizations have approval systems that end up being so onerous that it becomes impossible to perform. And this is something that actually I see quite often. Clarity, another key point that is really popping up here. And absolutely, we see this, that often people in comms are very happy to do what the bosses want, but what the bosses want is not clear, or it changes all the time. And again, that becomes very frustrating. And in an environment of high change, there tends to be high anxiety, high difference of opinion, high personalization of things. And so in such a context, we end up often in kind of mission impossible situations. And frankly, we've gotten very good at making things worse. The approval system thing is symptomatic of that, because when organizations are sort of in freak out mode, they tend to add layers and layers of risk management and approval, which only serves to disenable and disempower their communication teams. We're seeing also some great input here that you need more flexibility, need to deal with resistance to change, need to flatten hierarchy. Exactly. We've got to redefine the rules of the game in order to be able to perform. And we also need to have some level of clarity on prioritization so that we can focus appropriately and deliver to the highest and best value of our function. Okay, fantastic. So those are some great answers to our questions. We'll flip back here and I will share my screen. I'll just pause here and invite if anybody has a question or comment further to the Mentimeter if you want to jump in. Does anybody want to jump in? You're welcome to use the chat, or you can put yourself off silent if you want.
Caroline, it's showing the layout again.
Okay, sorry. Okay. There we go. Okay. Any questions at this point? We're good. Okay. So I'm going to just move on to a couple of concepts here, and then we can jump in at the end and get your reaction. So when I was mentioning earlier that change has changed, this is basically what I'm getting at here, is that it used to be that change was largely planned, and now it's emergent. So there isn't the visibility to where we're going that we used to have. And in fact, changes emerge from all over the place, and we may not quite have visibility to what's coming down the pike. Overwhelmingly, it used to be that change was the domain of leaders, that they would be bringing change from the top down. Now, what we're seeing is so much change is happening from the bottom up, including some of the social and political reckoning that organizations are going through. The whole backlash against return to office is another one. So we're seeing organic changes coming from the bottom up much, much more frequently. Another way you could think about this is that we used to be working in a solid state. That is to say, for example, if I think of our colleagues here at the University of Ottawa, we basically knew what the University of Ottawa was, what a university is, what a government organization is, what a private organization is. And now all of these things are fluid. And so we are in the highest period of change, probably since the Second World War. And in that context, we've lost our certainty anchors. We're at a period where the trust equation for main institutions, like, for example, trust in governments, universities, churches, and so on, is at an all-time low. And at the same time, paradoxically, we are craving certainty and clarity. And so you can see that in that kind of landscape, this is exactly where high-performing, creative, and gutsy communicators can totally shine in providing the kind of direction and clarity and focus that our audiences and our organizations are so desperately craving. Now, I often like to use this slide to sort of contextualize things, because even when we talk about change communication, that in itself can be quite confusing. So this is the framework that I would use, is that there is a bucket of expertise of strategic communications, and most of you today on the call are communications professionals from that discipline. Then there is a sister discipline of change management. Some of you may have done training in change management, like the ProSci methodology around ADKAR, and thinking about how do we try to promote change facilitation and mitigate resistance. And then there's a sweet spot in the middle, which is change communication. And that's quite a new discipline of expertise, and we'll be providing you at the end with some resources around that. But the main idea here is that you can see that not all communication has to do with change. Not all change management has to do with communication. But on the other hand, you certainly can't change anything unless you communicate something. So there is an overlap there, but they're not the same. And this is a battleground for enormous amounts of conflict and internal disconnect. Very, very often, this is what I hear, that change management people are frustrated that communications is not giving them what they want. On the other hand, communications professionals own the communication channels and are frustrated that change managers who may not have communication expertise are trying to drive the process. This can work in a bunch of different ways, and that's kind of outside the scope here. We're going to need a bigger boat to tackle that. But suffice it to say, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all model to this, except that awareness of this context and the functional buckets that are at play is really fundamental. Also important is to think about the organizational structure of change. So traditionally, you think about having a change sponsor, and that is the executive who is responsible and accountable for a change. So for example, you might have a CEO who is responsible for a reorg, or you might have a chief information officer who is responsible and accountable for a new IT system. Then you will have different structures in the middle. There might be a steering committee. You might have change agents, even if that's not their actual title. They may be people who are working as change agents, and communication professionals are very often in that category. And then you may have business partners like IT who are helping with a change. Then the organization are, in essence, the change targets, with the proviso that when you think about it, everybody is a change target, even the change sponsor, and that can also be a layer of disorientation. And we're seeing this a lot, frankly, with the return to office mandates, that change agents and managers and some sponsors are called upon to lead changes that they may not fully agree with. And they are squeezed because they are at once a change leader and also a change target at the same time. So just orienting yourself to the context of the players and the different roles can be a really important thing, frankly, to protect yourself, because very often change is some of the highest risk work that we can do. In that vein, I want to just run through quickly 3 main pitfalls to avoid. And this is a big one. You cannot care more or work harder than the change sponsor. And so, for example, if you have a change sponsor who is responsible for, let's say, a new technology system, and that person is not showing up and is not attending to the change, then you can be a superstar communications person. You are never going to be able to fulfill that difficulty. Similarly, we see this all the time with issues, for example, related to diversity and inclusion in the workplace. If the person in charge of inclusion and diversity in the workplace does not show up to the meetings about EDI and doesn't seem to care, you are never going to solve that problem from communications. And so this is just good to know, so that if you are put in a situation like this, it becomes immediately obvious and you can sort of spot the signs that you're being set up to fail, and then you can take steps to unwind that. But this happens a lot, and I've seen a lot of communicators in a painful squeeze of this nature. The next main pitfall to avoid is what I call complexification. And so, as I was saying earlier, we have gotten very good at making things worse. And I am noticing just an amazing vortex of complexification and swirling, and organizations are kind of struggling with their change agenda. So then they have more meetings and more committees, and then they pile more words onto more words. And then we've got this whole mountain of words. Generally no visuals, which is not cool, and nobody can quite grasp what the hell the change agenda actually is. So we really have to be able to cut through the noise to be able to focus on the signal and make sure that we are reducing complexity for the sake of complexity and keeping things very crisp, very clear, with muscular change communication statements that are easy to relate to. You want to make it easy for people to do the right thing. And then the third one, and this is one I'm particularly concerned about, is learned helplessness. That in this environment, psychologically and socially, where people are overwhelmed, they're fatigued by the pandemic and by the subsequent waves of disruption that have happened after that. And unfortunately, this has led many employees into a pattern of learned helplessness, which almost looks like a bug on their back waiting for somebody to turn them over, right? You see people, for example, waiting to be spoon-fed information. They'll complain they don't know who does what, or nobody ever told them this, because they're expecting some childlike weird pattern of spoon-feeding information rather than being intrapreneurial in our approach and to be resourceful to go get the information and context you need to be able to perform. So that's something to be mindful of, especially for those in leadership roles, because certainly you don't want to pander to learned helplessness. And I think it's important as communication practitioners that we set the tone for organizations. And that's the whole thing here. We're trying to bust out of traditional models that have held us back and pop up to a more senior level of contribution, including expectations for how does information and context flow in the organization, what are the responsibilities of communication teams and leaders, but also of employees who can't just be passive recipients in this dynamic. So very quickly, 3 key touchstones that I recommend for communicators interested in being change makers. The first one is to focus on sense making. And that, I think, is a really useful North Star. in essence, what I'm getting at here is you want to move away from being in the information dissemination game and instead focus on sense making. It's no longer good enough to just spew a bunch of words and hope something sticks at the back of the wall. It's more the heavy lift of making sense of things. For example, you think about Starbucks, and they have a corporate speak value of being customer centric. And you say, okay, well, what does customer centric mean if I'm a 20-year-old barista? Well, what it means is that every barista in every Starbucks around the world is empowered to fix somebody's order, even if they made it right the first time. They don't have to ask permission. They just, if you said you asked for an Americano and you got a latte instead, you will notice there's no questions asked. They'll just get you a new drink. That's a really good example of sense making. Some kind of corporate blah, blah word of customer centric that has been translated in a very crunchy, relatable context of behavior, that not only do we have a mindset that we're focused on customers, but also we know what the desirable behavior looks like. So that's the first one. The second is context. Context is king when we're dealing with change communication. The game is not just explaining your thing, it's explaining how the thing relates to the other things. And that's where the connective tissue is really fragmenting in organizations, especially because of hybrid workplaces where people have gone a little bit tunnel vision. So you as a communicator are really the master of context, of making sure employees have not only the right information, but critically the right context to be able to perform, that they know what's happening at different sort of levels of altitude, and that they've got the right context at the right time to perform at their best. And then the last touchstone is agency. What we know for sure and has remained unchanged in the discipline of change is that humans do best in dealing with change when we have a sense of agency, or another way to put this is a sense of control. And so where possible for you as a change maker, you can be the voice of your audiences in advocating what kind of sense of agency can we give people here. So for example, let's say the bosses have decided that company A and B are merging, and now we're going to be company C. We don't have choice over that because that's what the bosses have decided. But then how do we reimagine C? How do we create a sense of belonging? How do we connect and have meaningful conversations in an organization that has been newly constituted? These are hugely significant acts of agency that are very likely exactly in the sweet spot of elevating your performance and mitigating your risk. Lastly, my advice, if you want to be a communicator who is contributing as a change maker, is to command the space you occupy. And so I think communicators for too long have had a tendency to sort of shrink to fit. We have played small, we have been overly tactical, we have stayed in our functional bucket, and now the whole world has popped right open. And so there's no reason to be confined and to think small about your role when in fact it has never been more significant. And it's precisely in the context of this disruption and this lack of clarity that I think there's opportunity for you to really command the space you occupy, work to the full scope of your ability so that you can make the kind of impact and make the kind of difference that you really want. So in conclusion, we have made a web link here that you'll see at resultsmap.com PDI web. And this is an online page that we've created with some resources for you to kind of back up this curriculum. We've got information there that has to do with change communication, how to be an effective change agent, dealing with resistance, as well as some recommended readings from other authors. And so if you're wanting to build up your capabilities in the area of change communication and continue this reflection on how you can be a change maker from a communication stance, then I encourage you to take a look at those resources. Okay, so we have covered the material I was wanting to share today. So let's go back into the group and see if there are any questions from the group. Pascal is asking about the resources. So maybe Jordana, you can pop in the chat the web link where these resources will be available. You're also welcome to consult them when they're sent to you. So all of the participants will get a recording of today's session along with those resources.
So Carolyn, this is Sonia.
Hi.
So we currently do not have any questions in the Q&A chat. So I am going to take this opportunity to strongly encourage participants to drop your questions in the chat right now and ask them to Carolyn through the chat. So please go ahead.
Excellent. So you're welcome to pop any questions or reactions or anything you want to discuss further. You may well have a different perspective, so happy to chat about that, and you're welcome to just pop yourself off mute and join verbally, or if you want to pop a question online, you can totally do that as well. Go ahead, Monique. Hi, Monique.
Hi, Caroline. Thanks so much. So nice to see you here.
Likewise.
I'm trying to think here, and this is all great, like very relevant to my organization right now and to my work as well. And I love the idea that you shared about comment the space you occupy. I think that's really, really key right now. I was wondering if you have any thoughts. So in our case, most of the big changes, we're going through a huge transformation right now.
Yeah.
And most of them are led by people with business backgrounds.
Right.
The few people who have training in ProSci and come from that more kind of like business side of change.
Yes.
And they have an understanding of the communications function as a function within change. So the way they see communications is that change is driving everything. So we are here to kind of like serve change. And we've been struggling a little bit with that power dynamic because we are seeing that the employee engagement is not following as we would like it to follow, and even like reputation is starting to suffer as well. And I personally think that it's a little bit because of the way they see communications within that change. Not as a partner, but as like a little service. So I was just wondering thoughts on that and how to navigate that in a certain way.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, Monique. So I'm just going to put in here so that others can follow in the chat. I don't know why my name is coming up as Jordana as my colleagues, but anyway, I just put here. Oh, I was trying to put ProSci. So ProSci is the organization. It's spell checking. There you go. Okay. Well, the AI robots have taken over. So ProSci, PROSCI, is the organization that I think Monique is referring to, who are probably the largest purveyors of change management training in the world, particularly in North America. Their core model is called ADKAR. And so just for everybody's context, and so their idea, and I've done this certification program, it's a 3-day course and used to be kind of the go-to standard. It all revolves around ADKAR, which stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. So the idea is you cannot pass go until you go through these steps. You got to start with awareness, desire, and so on. Personally, I think this model is dead, because what we have seen in the context of the pandemic in particular is we never get to desire. Nobody desired a pandemic. Nobody desired having to stay home or wear a mask or all these things. And I think it's an overly rigid model that is actually now dangerous because it doesn't match the reality in which we're operating. That said, this is easy for me to say to you, Monique, because we're in the happy confines of this webinar. And in real life, we often find senior business executives who have big titles and have been certified in this methodology and feel that they know all the things about change management. So that can become quite difficult. And you're exactly correct. And you think you've put your finger on precisely the right thing here, that in that model, communication is one little piece. in the approach that we recommend, that I tend to use, both in my firm results map, but among also my kind of change guru, who is Daryl Connor. So there's a Connor partner change methodology. In that construct, communication is the life force of a change. It's actually what breathes oxygen in an organization to make change happen. And so that then becomes quite different. And we move away from being in a tactical box to being at a much more senior level. And that can be difficult because you find organizations sometimes have a very old school, rigid approach to change management that comes from ProSci. Also, something that I see often, because frankly, people call me, is that they will say, well, I don't necessarily trust my in-house comms people with this very sensitive change, and so I'm going to hire an external consultant. Well, of course, in that circumstance, that just creates a self-fulfilling prophecy that the communications shop can only deliver mediocrity because they don't have access to the right information at the right time. So I may not have solved your problem, but I am in violent agreement with your observation. And I can at least tell you that this is super, super common. And I do think it's a good occasion to renegotiate roles and responsibilities. And that's one of the main things, is to make sure you're set up to succeed. So for example, who is in charge of the change messaging? In many ways, even if your change sponsor sends out session information, let's say about training, that in itself is an act of communication, the way in which we invite people to training. So you may not be the boss of training, but you may in fact be responsible for messaging, because I bet you if messaging goes sideways, then they're going to come and say, well, Monique, nobody understands, and the message has gone sideways. So that's the thing that's not cool, is where communicators are very regularly put in a situation of being given a responsibility without the commensurate authority. Does that feel similar to your context? Yes. Okay.
Perfect
Yes.
diagnosis.
Okay. Okay, good. So in those online resources, you'll see some stuff about that, which I hope will be helpful. But at minimum, I can tell you, you are an excellent company, and I'm sure lots of folks on the call have experienced something similar. I'm just looking here on the chat. So we've got some good questions here in terms of getting some context on the language that we were using. We're talking about working on emergent change. So Shannon is asking about this in terms of tips or guidance to be more strategic for a not-for-profit organization. So a couple of ideas that would come up there. Hi, Shannon. Nice to see you. I think, first of all, when working on emergent change, one of the main things that can be helpful is to normalize that we're in the messy middle. So sometimes, especially perfectionists or people who come from professional backgrounds like doctors or engineers, like everything to be buttoned down. But if we're dealing in something that's emergent, that we're still trying to figure out, then it's normal that it's going to be a little bit messy. And that in itself can be very reassuring, because otherwise people feel that they're doing it wrong. Then they get agitated, then they get anxious, then they start bumping into each other, and then bad things happen. So that's what I would first recommend. And then the next thing that I tend to do, and we do a lot of work with not-for-profits, is to think about certainty anchors. So even if you've got, let's say, massive emergent change, we are going to have a new boss and a new structure, and we're not sure what our strategic plan is and all these things. But can we agree on certain certainty anchors that we can hold on to? Like, for example, our mission remains the same. We are a purpose-driven organization, and this is still our focus. We are still, our employment contracts are still in the same structure. So whatever those things are, you want to pop up and make evidence so that people feel that they've got some anchor points around them. And actually, a good analogy here is if you think about the peak chaos of COVID, when we were all kind of scrambly and confused, what are the things that helped people cope? And maybe even if you think about your own experience, they tended to be around these certainty anchors to say, okay, well, I don't know what the hell's going on out there, but I know that my children are my top priority. And I know that my family is around me. And then I do better when I do a yoga class every day. So these kinds of things that you can identify and call out as certainty anchors, that would be my other recommendation. Does that make sense? Or do you want to add to this, Shannon?
That's great. I know right now with our teams, it's difficult with the change in government policy too.
Yes.
It's just emerging and changing really fast, right? Like in BC and federally. But yeah, but this helps too. Just always coming back to those anchors and reminding the teams of that. Thank you.
Good. You're welcome. I'm digging this outdoor decor. That's lovely. Mia has a really good question here around talking about the sense of agency. So that is a really important thing. And in fact, there's interesting research that shows that even if you deal with change that is definitely negative, like let's say we worked with a not-for-profit that was shutting down offices because of budget constraints. So this is a good example where the ADKAR model doesn't really work because you're never going to get people to desire that we're shutting down the office in Moncton and Regina, let's say. But if you can tell people to say, okay, unfortunately, due to budget constraints, we're having to close these offices. Here's how our outplacement is going to work. You can do outplacement online or in person. You can get your severance pay upfront or in monthly fashion. You can participate in individual or group coaching for counseling on outplacement. Those kinds of micro choices give people a sense of agency. So they at least have a sense that they have some control, because human beings are hardwired for homeostasis and control. And that's why any change, even if I push up against your hand, the natural reaction is going to be to push back. That's just the way neurologically we're wired. And so you attenuate that effect to the extent that you can give micro choice, even in a situation in which there's very little choice and very little desire, like, for example, downsizing. Okay. Let's see here. Certainty anchors, that seems to be resonating with people. So that's a good concept to look up. Brian Gorman is a great author who's written lots about this. Then Rupal has a question about driving communications for a large audience spread across the world. What strategies can be used to guarantee clarity and alignment across a diverse workforce? Okay, so that's a great question. And I would say, first of all, I would be loath to guarantee clarity, because people often will make things up or interpret things in their own way. So we're probably not in the guarantee business. But I think my instinct here would be to think about creating a communication system. So where we run into trouble is where we're overly reliant on one channel of communication. So in this case, there might be an international announcement that's made, and then it's cascaded across regions and across managers who are given consistent messaging. I would be attentive to the way in which messaging is done, focus more on visuals and less words, and also put the accountability on leaders to communicate. So this sense-making activity is really one of line of sight that has to happen across an organization. Can't just be from one boss, can't either be from the communications team. And when we're talking about organizational change management team, they can certainly help, but almost certainly there isn't the adequate resources there. So any organization is going to do better by recruiting an army of internal communicators rather than an army of outsourced communicators, for one thing, or having a delusional expectation that one person can handle this task. It really has to do with baking this into the expectation of leadership, I think. Great question. Okay, so I'm mindful of our time wrapping up, and I think Serge is going to wrap us up with a few words. So I will, certainly before I hand it off, just thank you so much for your participation in these terrific questions. We are easy to find if you have any additional questions or looking for resources. And again, there is a web URL that's been created for the session. We hope that this may also pique your interest in deepening your exploration around how to be an effective change maker. And you are welcome to join our next cohort of the Leadership Development Program for Communicators, which is taking place in person and online in November, and then again in the spring. And the University of Ottawa's fantastic Professional Development Institute is putting on the program, which I animate and is the highlight of my year. So with that, let's hand it off if Serge wants to wrap us up for the afternoon.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm actually going to be
Oh, hi,
replacing
Paul.
Serge.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Nice to see you.
you. Great session. So, of course, I would like to thank you very much for today's session. Just to share with everybody, my personal key takeaways from the webinar was how change is now emergent, bottom-up, and fluent. So I think that's a very good perspective to have, but also to share among all leaders. And I really liked, and something that's going to kind of stay with me as I continue my day, is the concept of reducing unnecessary complexity and the learned helplessness, because I think we've all kind of faced stakeholders who have that learned helplessness that needs to be transformed into resourcefulness. So as Caroline was mentioning earlier, I encourage also everyone to explore the new Leadership Development Program for Communicators. Now is the time to apply. Do not hesitate. You do have till November 1st, but applications is open. The cohort does start November 19th. Last but not least, I want to thank everyone for participating today and joining the call. So for us, from a U Ottawa PDI perspective, it's really important to us, really close to our mandate, to convene these webinars, to share the best practices, the knowledge, and of course, exchange with professionals such as yourself. So thank you very much for taking the time. Wishing everyone a great afternoon.
Wonderful. Un gros merci, Paul. Thanks, everyone. Hope to keep in touch. Be well.